Hey, Damon DeMarco here for CreateX3.com. Welcome back, or if this is your first time, welcome. Blah, 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 hit like, subscribe, blah, blah, blah. I don't know, hasn't that kind of jumped the shark at this point? It has for me. But yeah, hit the button and ring the bell, and that way you'll be notified of all the videos that I load. Today's topic is the shadow. It's actually like the first of what I believe is going to be a 3 or 4 part series. And I mentioned it in the last video. You can see that right up in here or up in here. A lot of people wanted to talk about the shadow and how it plays into the life of an artist. Disclaimer, I'm not a therapist. I'm not a PhD in psychology. I'm not an LC MSW. I'm a writer, which means that I'm a frightening, weird combination of stuff I've put into practice, stuff that I've read about, stuff that I've observed. Just being a human being and watching other human beings. So don't operate any heavy machinery while watching this video, unless that piece of machinery is a typewriter. I do that all the time after thinking about the shadow and working with the shadow. A lot of times I'll use a typewriter or a fountain pen. I think those are entirely fine pieces of machinery to operate, maybe even a stapler. Okay, but no backhoes, no forklifts, thermonuclear reactors. Legal disclaimer, here, and don't do anything that I wouldn't do. Okay? Before we really get into talking about how to use the shadow in our work, we really have to define what the shadow is. So that's pretty much what part 1 of this video is going to be about. What the hell is the shadow? Well, one of the things you'll understand quickly is that it's probably the most misused psychological term that I've heard of in recent years. Let's wind things back a little bit. Everybody has heard of Sigmund Freud. He's the founder of psychoanalysis. Well, Freud believed in a set of influences on psychological thought, which have to do primarily with something called the libido, or the sexual urge. And if I'm reading this correctly, what Freud said is that the life energy, the libido, is what propels us forward to do certain things. And when that libido is blocked in any way, typically by social conditioning, then we begin to develop something called neuroses, which are these little quirks that human beings have. The natural flow of our human energy, which is in its purest form somewhat barbaric and primitive and compassionate and warm. There are many different aspects to it, but it's the totality of this incredible energy which, when blocked, begins to manifest a whole bunch of wacky stuff, which we call neurotic behavior or quirks. So that was Freud, and Freud had a few disciples, notably Carl Jung, whose name I just love to pronounce, and I'm probably doing it poorly, but I'll try it again. Jung. Say it with me. Jung. Jung had a very, very different idea about how psychology evolves in the human mind. It's much more mythological. It has to do with archetypes. And he believed also that there is a level to human consciousness which is called the collective unconscious. And in that collective unconscious, we are all connected. One of the things that Carl Jung proposed was this concept of the shadow. And in my reading of it, it's that we all carry an aspect of ourselves that we hide from the world, and indeed, not just the world, but from ourselves. Like right now, you're looking at a picture of me, right? There's a light source coming in here. There's light behind me. You can see me. And you may have ideas about my behavior and my deportment. This is not the total me. You've never seen me really angry or lustful or anything that is not condoned by YouTube or society, for that matter. And so a lot of people are conditioned at an early age to take these pieces of themselves and shove them away, repress them, suppress them, put them away, hide them from the light, because they are essentially non-social tendencies. And they get pushed down into an area of ourselves where we completely forget about them, and that is called the unconscious, not the subconscious. I once had a therapist friend of mine explain to me that subconscious is a Hollywood term. Basically, you have that which is conscious, that which you know about yourself, that which you've done the work on, you've uncovered the stones and you've looked beneath them and you'd say, I can be a real this in this situation, or this really brings this out of me, and so forth. You're conscious of those aspects of yourself. And then you have the flip side of the coin. You have that which is unconscious, not yet revealed, about your own character, about your own proclivities, and so forth. And that part which is unconscious is the shadow. So this is very important to cover because Jung was very clear on this. And this is where I think a lot of people go wrong with the shadow. The shadow is not evil. Evil is a concept which is not even germane to this exploration at this point. Just leave it aside. Again, what is visible, what is conscious, that is one thing, and what is unconscious is the shadow. I once read that Jung himself got very fed up with other Jungians who kept mischaracterizing the shadow. They kept saying, oh, it's this and it's that, it's the evil, it's the sad part, it's the this part, it's the destructive part. And he essentially just threw up his hands and he said, no, the shadow is simply all that is unconscious. That's it. Which means that it could include all those other parts, right? The sad, the destructive, and all that stuff, the so-called negative parts of our character. But it could also include very positive aspects of our character and of our creative process. In other words, when we're ordered at a young age to put a piece of ourselves away, and I'll go into that in a moment, yes, we sometimes take the antisocial tendency and we put it away in our shadow, but also with that many times goes a very positive attribute as well. For instance, the poet and writer Robert Bly, whose work I've had the good fortune to stumble across at a certain point in my life, and I really recommend it. He wrote a book called Iron John, which is primarily a book geared toward men, and he also wrote a book called The Little Book of the Human Shadow, which is exactly what it is. It's a little tiny book about this thin, and it talks about his explorations, his concept of what the shadow is. Bly writes in The Little Book of the Human Shadow, "The brighter the light, the darker the shadow. Each of us has some part of our personality that is hidden from us. Parents and teachers in general urge us to develop the light side of the personality, move into well-lit subjects such as mathematics and geometry, and to become successful. The dark part then becomes starved." Bly goes on to reflect about his own childhood growing up in, I think it was Minnesota, but it's a small town up in the northern parts of the United States, and he writes, "When we were 1 or 2 years old, we had what we might visualize as a 360-degree personality. Energy radiated out from all parts of our body and all parts of our psyche. A child running is a living globe of energy. But one day, we noticed that our parents didn't like certain parts of that ball. They said things like, 'Can't you be still?' Or, 'It isn't nice to try and kill your brother.'" If you're a parent and you're being honest, that's kind of how things operate with your kids, right? And that's probably how things operated when you were a child and your parents parented you. There's a certain disciplining that goes on, and as we mold the child to conform to societal ideas, well, every time we mold a piece of clay, it does take a certain shape, but it loses a certain potentiality. Do you agree? Bly goes on to compare the shadow at this point to an invisible bag that we all kind of carry around with us and throw or tuck or shove inside this bag all the things that we're told aren't good, aren't acceptable, aren't laudable. And he goes on to write, "Behind us we have an invisible bag, and the part of us our parents don't like, we, to keep our parents' love, put in the bag. By the time we go to school, our bag is quite large. Then our teachers have their say, 'Good children don't get angry over such little things.' So we take our anger and put it in the bag. By the time my brother and I were 12 in Madison, Minnesota," see, I told you it was in Minnesota, "we were known as the Nice Bly Boys. Our bags were already a mile long." So when a child is disciplined, I'm using children because it's an obvious instance, but when a child is disciplined, we might say to them, no, don't do that. And then suddenly, yes, okay, maybe an antisocial tendency goes into the shadow bag, but maybe if we're of a very linear bent as parents, we could say, no, don't paint a picture. No, because society, artists are always starving. Oh, no, don't write a story. No, don't spend your time doing that. What you need to do is become an accountant or a dentist or an actuary. Even the tiniest cues given to a child get picked up on immediately. So they put, many times, we put into our shadow bag not only, again, the antisocial tendencies, but also the tendencies that could make us wonderful singers or fantastic guitar players or gymnasts cartoonists or poets. Do you see where I'm going with it? Many times when something so-called negative gets put into the shadow bag, well, accompanying that is something that is very, very positive, and given the particular proclivities of our Western culture, many times that something that goes into the shadow bag is also artistic. This is my opinion. Pardon me if I go off on a rant here. Artists have always been frowned on in society. We're treated as if we're some kind of alien race. Artists in our society are only really listened to if they're bazillionaires and they're making a lot of money and they're tastemakers and they're altering the zeitgeist with their work. But the fact of the matter is, everybody has artistic tendencies. Everybody does. And if we were to listen to those a little bit more, we might not have so many of the problems that we have right now in society. I'm just throwing it out there. You don't have to agree with me, by the way. If you don't agree with me on that, you can just not subscribe, or if you've already subscribed, you can unsubscribe. I really don't care. But that's the way I see things. It's critical to know that different cultures respect different values. And so in many cases, what one culture says, no, that's not good, you got to put that into the shadow bag, and other cultures say, I don't care. Like, I've met a lot of people from former Soviet bloc nations, Eastern Europe in general, and they have a bluntness to them, a directness to them that I think most Americans would find off-putting. They're like, it's stupid. That's stupid what you do. Stupid. They're not being rude in their culture. They're just being very direct. But here in America, I think a lot of times it's like, it's affrontive. So that's a tendency that we, as I've noticed it, here in the West would throw into the shadow bag immediately. But a different culture honors that. They've been through pogroms. They've been through countless wars on their own soil. Perhaps one could say they just don't have any time for the filigree, the niceties that other people enjoy. I'm not making an argument for or against it. I'm just saying that different cultures have different ideas about what goes into the shadow bag and what stays out in the open. Creativity often goes headfirst into the shadow bag. I once overheard, this is a true story, I once overheard a mother telling her child here in Manhattan, don't paint a picture. No, painting a picture is for babies. Let's work on your math problems now, okay? Let's start working on the math workbook. And I mean, I was like, just looking at the child and seeing like this, the instantaneous assimilation of that opinion as fact. I have no idea where that child is right now, but I can almost guarantee you that that child will never doodle on a napkin. He is never going to become a Pablo Picasso. He's never going to become a insert visual artist here. He might even frown upon them his entire life because deep back in his unconscious, he has his mother's voice telling him, no, outsiders and outcasts are people who paint pictures. And so it goes. But you know, this thing about the shadow, it offers artists an ideal opportunity to recover themselves by examining their shadow. If you're watching this right now, and I'm sure a lot of you, you're accomplished artists. In whatever art you practice, that's fantastic. But I also suspect that many of you are people who really want to develop your creativity. I mean, that's kind of what I founded the channel for in the first place. And you might be asking yourself, well, how do you do that? Well, my first recommendation is that you go into your shadow and you start to pick through that stuff that you have unconsciously shoved away. And it's going to take a lot of work, but as you sort through that, you're going to begin to pick up little pieces and you're going to look at them and you're going to say, oh my God, that happened to me when I was 5. I have a vague recollection of it. Memories will come up. Associations will come up. And it's your job, really. It's your privilege in a way to go through the ruins of your childhood and reconstruct it to a certain degree. Find the nuggets of gold that were tossed out with the ashes and the debris. And when you do that, what's going to happen is you're suddenly going to become a wealthier person. I'm not saying financially wealthier, although that would be a lovely thing, and it frequently happens. I am saying, however, that you're going to become a more complete person. You're going to become a more aware, self-aware person. And when you become more self-aware, you're more aware of the world in general. I want to read to you something else that Robert Bly writes about this recovery process through the medium of the shadow. Suppose a young man seals a bag at 20, he writes, and then waits 15 or 20 years before he opens it again. What will he find? Sadly, the sexuality, the wildness, the impulsiveness, the anger, the freedom he put in have all regressed. They are not only primitive in mind, they are hostile to the person who opens the bag. That's why a lot of people who go through therapy and go to a different level of therapy, you hit a certain point of it and all of a sudden you just get enraged for no apparent reason. And frequently what happens, that just projects itself directly out onto the therapist. If you're not in therapy, it could happen to a relationship. You could be really, really close to somebody and they hit some button in you and you didn't even know that all that stuff was in there, and then it just, the floodgates open and it all comes pouring out. Very, very human. Very human. The man who opens his bag at 45, or the woman who opens her bag, rightly feels fear. She glances up and sees the shadow of an ape passing along the alley wall. Anyone seeing that would be frightened. Bly continues to write, I think we could say that most males in our culture put their feminine side or interior woman into the bag. When they begin, perhaps around 35 or 40, trying to get in touch with their feminine side again, she may be, by then, truly hostile to them. The same man may experience, in the meantime, much hostility from women in the outer world. The rule seems to be the outside has to be like the inside.
Basically, the outside is the inside, and the inside is the outside.
Pause. I'm not going to vouch for any of that. That's too big of a topic for me. In this day and age, we've seen gender studies blossom into much larger topics, and sexual orientation is much more open. It still has a long way to go, but it is certainly much more open than it used to be. So this is Bly's opinion. I'm not vouching for it. However, I can say that in my own experience, there is a grain of truth to that. When the pieces of our experience go into that bag, they kind of knock around in there and they sort of kick in there and they kind of take on a life of their own. Do you know what I mean? And sometimes when you open that bag in earnest, looking to see what's in there, they can be very, very startling creatures. And some of them are ferocious about their privacy. They do not want to be let loose. So take Bly's notion, I think, of orientation and sexuality and that sort of thing with a grain of salt. Apply it to your own experience. Obviously, the core of it, as far as I can see, is that we all have within us things that we have been made to feel ashamed of, or that we have been made to think are less than worthy, or that we have been made to fear. And who put those things there? By and large, society did, or role models did at an early age, and they molded the figure of who we are. And it might not necessarily be true. It's really up to us to kind of go through there again and figure out which of those parts can be recovered and restored, and which parts we can say, maybe it's not a good idea to kill your sister with a ball-peen hammer. You're right. That was just a momentary impulse that I had when I was 4. Not a good idea. But you see, it's not about pushing it into the shadow bag at that point, because then it goes back into the unconscious. And if it's in the unconscious, if it is suppressed and repressed, what can happen then is that it has control over us because it has been shoved down. Here's a perfect analogy, I think. Have you ever tried holding a beach ball under the water? You push it down and you push it down, and the harder you push it down, what happens? The buoyancy pushes it back up. So the harder you push down, the more the buoyancy comes back up. And that's what Bly was saying about this notion of inside matching the outside. And that's a hermetic value, by the way. If you study perennialism, if you study ancient philosophy, ancient wisdom, the Hermetics said that. As within, so without, as without, so within. Plutarch said it, by the way. It's one of my favorite quotes. That which we achieve inwardly will change our outer reality. So the idea is that the more work we do on ourselves internally, the more we can change outer reality, our circumstances, our interactions with other people, our relationships to not just the world, but in this specific context, our creativity. And so that's what we're going to get to in part 3 of this video, where I'm just going to recommend some exercises that I use all the time and that I know other people use as well to really kind of dig into the shadow in a way that is very curious and safe and sometimes a little bit daring. Okay, you have to be a little bit daring with the shadows sometimes, I find, but it's worth it. It's always worth it. And we'll continue this for next time. If you haven't done so already, like and subscribe. Blah, 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 blah. I hope you got something out of this video. If you're really interested, by all means, comment down below there. One thing that I will do is, since I mentioned Robert Bly's book, A Little Book of the Human Shadow, there will be a link to it down in the comments, okay? So if you want to order that, the book is literally like this thick. I wouldn't even call it this thick, it's this thin. But it's a great read, and it's very compelling, and I personally learned a lot from it, so maybe you would like to read it as well. So if you want that, down here. Thanks very much for coming. From CreateX3.com, Damon DeMarco here. Stay happy, stay healthy, and stay creative.